Housing's f***ed. Every week there's a new way to describe how f***ed housing is in this country. Even the last resort that most people view public housing as is in short supply, with upwards of 60,000 households on the public housing waiting list, who on average wait up to a year. People fleeing domestic violence on average wait up to 2 years. Even by the state government's own increase, public housing is underfunded, the conditions are subpar, and their age makes them increasingly outdated.
Melbourne's public housing towers are now closer to being torn down.
Certain people don't know where they're going to move.
Residents are falling through the cracks. Minister, which body is responsible for holding...
All of this precarity and instability around housing is severely detrimental for our health and well-being. A 2011 Victorian government study discusses how these conditions are terrible for people's mental and physical well-being. And so, the Victorian government has decided that it's going to demolish all of its public housing and rebuild new, improved and more houses. However, not all of the new housing will be public housing. There still will be public housing, but there will be much more non-governmental and private housing built on previously publicly held land. It'll be argued that this approach fails on two fronts. One, this social mix model is ineffective at the goal of destigmatization and instead creates segregation that negatively impacts public housing tenants. Two, while the number of units will technically increase, the majority of public housing residents will be permanently displaced and the number of bedrooms most of the time actually falls. What this is successful in doing is delivering profit to the developers and organizations that will own previously public land and housing, which will make it increasingly difficult to bring down homelessness and the public housing waiting list. It'll also be effective at increasing the supply of housing, though the extent to which is marginal compared to the amount that developers would have built anyway had the government not sold the land. Of course, this isn't the first time that the state government has embarked on a policy of clearance in the pursuit of urban renewal and ostensibly in the interest of the public.
Beautiful Melbourne from 1947 exposes the appalling living conditions of families living in the inner Melbourne suburb of Fitzroy, long before the hipsters came in small, overcrowded, dilapidated, mouldy and vermin-infested dwellings. The film, with a sense of humanity, shows us the true state of poverty in raw footage that is powerful and shameful.
Health and well-being concerns were something, at least nominally, shared by the people who first built these, as for most of Victoria's history, this land was instead covered by severely overcrowded slums. As put by the Housing Investigation and Slum Abolition Board, slums emerged due to residential areas being demolished in favour of growing industrialists and what were known as private slum landlords taking advantage of people needing homes close to the city for their work. Unfortunately, children represented 46% of residents living in slum housing. As one minister kindly put it, these slums were a hotbed of criminality and non-compliance. Sorry, that was the current Victorian government describing the public housing towers in 2020. Back then, before the towers were actually built, the ministers were saying that the slums were the cesspools of humanity. So how did these cesspools of humanity become a hotbed of criminality and non-compliance?
The Housing Commission's first high-rise development.
Through the 60s, 70s and 80s, 44 towers in total were built over these slums. These were part of broader plans to completely redevelop entire suburbs into neat, bland squares of high-rises next to planned multi-lane freeways, which you can somewhat see materializing here on Hoddle Street. While the slums were a huge problem, the slum clearances and construction of the towers actually displaced most of the people the government sought to house. Only a small portion of those displaced by the clearances were resettled into their communities.
And if we let this freeway go through, it's going to go through the whole of Glebe and Redfern and Chippendale. And the people on low incomes who can't afford to buy their own homes are going to be forced out further and further into the outer suburbs.
It was very much a plan dreamt up by the political class, which very conveniently benefited their mates in real estate. And even for the residents, life wasn't particularly stellar. To put it mildly, the stock management practices of the Housing Commission in the 60s and 70s were appalling. Maintenance standards were barely adequate, and there was no systematic process of periodic renovation and upgrading of the older stock. Very little was spent on estate improvement and upgrading works over a 20-year period, with the result that there was an enormous legacy of housing neglect, particularly on the estates. As the then state Liberal government was planning to buy up a bunch of land to then build the towers on, they may or may not have given a little tip-off to property investors who then bought up the otherwise cheap land and sold it to the state government for a tidy profit. And while the Cain Labor government in the 1980s made a lot of progress, like increasing funding for maintenance and improvements, the government oversaw a 136% increase in the public housing waiting lists. Starting in 1993, triannual reports from the Auditor General going into the early 2000s indicted respective Victorian governments for failing to sufficiently act upon growing waiting lists and deteriorating conditions, despite funding for maintenance and improvements steadily rising. Local media even began likening the government to the slum landlords it had replaced, after reporting on countless cases of tenants calling for help and assistance, ultimately on deaf ears. By 2012, the Auditor General reiterated that the situation for public housing in Victoria is critical, and that the long-term provision of this vital public service is at risk. For most of their lifetime, these towers have been underfunded and neglected. When former Liberal Premier Jeff Kennett planned to demolish and sell them off, he even thought that cost too much.
I have done this with a heavier heart than you can possibly imagine, given that most of you don't think I have any heart at all.
However, with the 2014 election of the Andrews government, one dominated by the left-wing faction of the Labor Party, there was an expectation and maybe a hope that things would change.
The people of Victoria have today overwhelmingly endorsed a positive and optimistic plan for our state.
In 2014, Daniel Andrews and the Victorian Labor Party were elected with 47 of the 88 seats in Parliament. Since he has delivered Labor larger and larger majorities in both the 2018 and 2022 elections. Most of us know him from COVID.
And get on the beers.
Up until 2017, however, his government's public housing policy was not that much different to his predecessors. This is in spite of that previously mentioned 2012 Auditor General report finding that the public housing sector was not only in a critical condition, but that since 2006, consecutive governments of both political parties have failed to take action despite being warned numerous times of deteriorating conditions. A 2017 Auditor General report and update on the 2012 paper once again found that public housing in Victoria was in a critical condition, describing the government's policies and practices as disjointed, poorly communicated, and lacking in a comprehensive understanding of asset performance. Of course, Dan has shown himself to be much more ambitious in other areas than his predecessors, particularly in the latter half of his premiership. In the first few years of his premiership though, nothing really happened for public housing. Interestingly, Tim Pallas, who'd later become the Treasurer, would say that the previous Liberal government failed to make any significant investments in the public housing stock across the board, which, you know, fair call, they only built about 1,000 dwellings.
The government in the last decade has only built 300 public homes.
By 2017, the Andrews government announced the Public Housing Renewal Program, which, after the plethora of reports and bad press around the conditions of the state's public housing, was a commitment to upgrade and renew the government's housing stock. There are a bunch of estates that have been already redeveloped or are under redevelopment, like for example the Ascot Vale estate. The PHRP is now accompanied by the broader Big Housing Build, which was the $5.3 billion centerpiece to the Andrews government's public housing policy. The third and most recent housing initiative of the Andrews government is the planned demolition of all 44 of these towers and replacing them instead with newly renovated and upgraded blocks. This all sounds great. I mean, finally, a premier actually addressing these cesspools of humanity.
You know, since Henry Bolte, all I know is he's the best Premier Victoria's had since Henry Bolte. He did a magnificent job as Premier of the state.
This has probably been the most ambitious government since the Bulk government on public housing, despite some hiccups along the way.
The timing of the lockdown of North Melbourne and Flemington public housing towers on July 4th was not based on direct health advice and violated Victorian human rights laws, an investigation by the Victorian Ombudsman has found.
But regardless of the ambition of this government and of surface level media write-ups and glossy department pages, this is not good. The term social housing is an umbrella term for a few different types of housing. Public housing refers to government-owned and managed housing, and rent is a flat 25% of your income. Community housing refers to non-governmental organization, housing association, not-for-profit or charity-owned and managed housing. They take around 25 to 30% of your income, plus any rental assistance you may be entitled to. Affordable housing refers to privately owned housing that is artificially made cheaper than the rest of the market through subsidies, usually 75 to 80% of market rent. Historically, governments have built largely public housing, such as the housing towers we've been talking about. In recent decades, however, there's been a marked shift in attitudes and policies towards housing, specifically in the sale or diversification of the public housing stock in favour of a more competitive, marketized system. The demolitions and reconstructions of existing estates under the PHRP will build more units, yet many, anywhere up to 70%, are community and/or private affordable housing. In the government's big housing build, $3.7 billion of that $5.3 billion is going towards community and affordable housing. The demolition and reconstruction of the public housing towers will replace the existing 10,000 tenants with 30,000 public, community and private tenants, but only 11,000 of those will be social housing, not even public housing. So 11,000 unspecified public or community tenants and 19,000 fully private tenants. But surely diversifying and cooperating with the non-governmental and private sector to deliver more affordable housing to people is a good thing, right? It shouldn't matter where it comes from or who's owning it, so long as people have roofs over their heads, right? If anything, wouldn't some level of decentralization, deregulation, and competition make housing better for people?
One of the biggest shake-ups in terms of delivering more housing and more housing choices and options that our state has ever seen.
That's been the rationale for pursuing non-governmental housing over public housing, which specifically in Victoria became prevalent in the 1980s when the Kane Labor government began subsidising community housing after beginning to abandon building government-owned public housing. Then in 2006, the then Brack's Labor government picked it back up when pursuing the housing redevelopment projects for the Kensington and Carlton Estates. These projects were descendants of a broader socio-economic trend of privatisation and commercialisation of government services. The community housing invested in by John Cain's government in the 1980s were slightly different to the model later adopted by Bracks, Brumby, Andrews and now Allen. While funnily enough it was the Liberal Party in 1981 that kickstarted the initiative, the Cain Labor government through the Rental Housing Cooperative Program began to co-invest with the private sector into cooperative rental housing. Now this is worth its own separate deep dive, but the program evolved into what's now known as the Common Equity Rental Cooperative or CERC model, nowadays administered by the property provider Common Equity Housing Limited. Fast forward to 1999, Liberal Premier Jeff Kennett decided that actually, specifically, one of the Kensington estates from before wasn't too expensive to demolish, and so he knocked it down. Uncharacteristically, Kennett didn't sell the public land, but it was the following Labor Premier Steve Bracks who put it up for tender. Bracks also demolished the rest of the Kensington estate houses in the end, demolishing 486 units of public housing out of the 694 in total. The government awarded the property to the developers at Becton Corporation, who, alongside the government, built and redeveloped a total of 941 units, with 46% being public and 54% being private and community housing. This is what's called a social mix. It's basically a theory that suggests that if you mix or pepper private housing in public housing estates, you raise more money to invest and you can reduce the stigma of low-income housing as those with higher incomes live alongside those who need the public housing. Now, this 200-page report, the Kensington Evaluation Report, was supposed to be published in 2013. However, the report was covered up by the government and it was only made public by a parliamentary inquiry in 2018. Mostly because it wasn't very nice to the government. It concluded that the redevelopment model at Kensington should not be reproduced in the same arrangement on other estates. For starters, the facilities and infrastructure at the estate were segregated to the advantage of private renters. This is because private investors are more likely to concentrate their investment in areas with higher real estate values. So while public housing tenants were open to it, the intended mixing of public and private tenants never materialized. This meant that the stigma associated with public housing remained, but instead of being a regionalized association, the stigma fell on individual units or blocks. Now, while there was an overall increase in the supply of housing, there was a net reduction of 265 public housing units. This was a problem because not only are public homes more in demand as those who can afford to privately rent are more able to find housing elsewhere, and conversely, public tenants aren't as flexible, but it meant that by default, many of the original public housing residents could not return to their homes. This isn't even to mention the costs and impacts of displacement, moving, finding new accommodation, school and facilities for kids, all of that stuff. And so what happened is that only 20% of the original residents were able to return to their newly built homes. Internationally, there is evidence to suggest that the relocation of residents as a part of urban renewal schemes comes at the cost with detrimental impacts on physical and mental health, as well as the impacts of families, friends and communities who are all impacted as the social, economic and health effects of those displaced ripple out. Reports show documented evidence of death, suicide and as a direct result of displacement from urban renewal. If you've got a good memory, you would have observed a pattern here. Back when the towers were first built, the people who lived in the slums, the people who were cleared from the areas, weren't really the ones living in the newly built towers. What's worse, or better, depending on who you're asking, is that this redevelopment was an absolute goldmine for developers and investors. Beckton made a 37.56% profit, way above the anticipated 20%. Investors and developers were given otherwise very expensive inner city land at relatively cheap prices, which they let out to renters or they sold outright, either approach accruing a significant return. The second major pilot project was in Carlton. Between 2006 and 2011, 192 units were demolished and replaced by 246 new units, or an increase of 54 public houses. Surely a good thing, right? Well, the issue was that while there was technically an increase in units, there actually ended up being less beds per unit. All in all, there was a net reduction from 576 beds to 444. The government claimed that this was because the multi-bedroom units were being underutilized, but this just isn't borne out in the data, which very clearly shows many thousands of families being on the public housing waiting list and issues with overcrowding in public housing. Furthermore, the redevelopment at Carlton was tilted much more towards the private sector than in Kensington, with a ratio of 73 to 27, or 663 new private dwellings. In interviewing both private and public tenants, Arthurson et al. 2024 notes the disparities and inherent segregation present in the social mix model.
There is an upper class always blocking you. You can see green on the other side, and on our side, all you can see is no backyard, no nothing. Their view is to each other, facing each other, where there is an open area in the middle.
The paper found that more often than not, the public tenants were more open to socializing with private tenants, that they opposed the overt segregationary measures such as a literal wall blocking off the two communities. Now, this is one of the worst examples, but this woman who was interviewed sounds like a feudal lord or something, living near the peasantry.
Adding to the insult of not being told about the neighbours I would have is the mounds of unsightly refuse public tenants have on their balconies, whilst I'm not permitted to even leave my broom on the balcony, let alone my washing to dry on a warm sunny day without receiving a breach notice. My balcony cannot be seen from Rathdown or Princes Street, but the public flat balconies can be seen in all their revolting glory as you walk or drive past. Just say you hate poor people.
Like the Kensington example, the government tried to keep data and analysis covered up, and so it made the jobs of researchers quite hard. As a result, the specific number of people who were displaced was difficult for researchers to find, but the few they did find on their own suggested that the government failed to keep their promise of allowing them to return home. Regardless, all of the available literature on these two respective pilot projects come to unanimously negative conclusions. In other words, don't fucking do that shit again. Keep this in mind for later, but there is not a single academic, keyword there academic, source that supports this approach towards building and redeveloping housing. This isn't even a partisan thing. Both Liberal and Labor state governments presided over these projects. It just so happens that there were more Labor governments than Liberal governments. Although, Labor did try to make it a partisan thing back in 2013. If you don't believe me, don't believe the research, don't believe the tenants themselves, then maybe you'll believe an authorised Labor Party ad. This was a Labor Party ad being critical of the Napthine Liberal government's plans for public housing redevelopment.
My name is Merepara Epere. I'm chairperson of the Tenants Association DECTA, Incorporated of the Collingwood, Abbotsford and part of Clifton Hill residents. To have their rent raised to 30% or whatever, it's going to be hardship. They've got families to look after, and I think it's very cruel that the minister should even think of doing this. Sell off the housing, public housing.
Because it's very well located.
Where are they going to live? What? Is he going to sell them off while people are still living in it? To relocate these people to other areas, they're going to become isolated. They're going to withdraw from society. I found the minister very unapproachable, not friendly. I don't really read people, but I read her as arrogant. She couldn't even really tell the truth, and that was the sad part. But what we had to listen to was the presentation of an agency. These people didn't even know what they were talking about. And there were a lot of things that they said that wasn't even true. What kind of minister would do that?
Believe it or not, the state government has overwhelmingly ignored consensus developed out of literally hundreds of pages of incredibly thorough research. I mean, seriously, for such a niche topic, there's a bunch of literature and resources that I found in my room on my laptop, a lot of which were commissioned by the government. Across these 750 studies that have investigated this social mix model, a whopping zero studies are supportive of the model's implementation. What those studies do find is that this social mix model most likely results in
the permanent loss of public land, low yields of affordable housing, negative targeting of race and ethnicity, class antagonism and conflict within given areas, displaced and further segregated residents, loss of social housing, particularly bedrooms, and homogenisation of populations at the scale of the neighbourhood.
Even the government's own increase said, yeah, we should probably conduct a study to see if this model works. No such study has been published to this point. Despite this, the government has gone ahead with the PHRP, which is pretty much exactly ended up like the Kensington and Carlton examples, except worse somehow. For instance, the 18 Miller Street estate was supposed to be demolished and rebuilt into that kind of socially mixed housing project. As you can see, there's no such housing and there hasn't been for ages. Not only that, but the government has just completely abandoned any attempt to build any public or affordable housing here at all. This is one of 15 sites that were originally set to have social and affordable housing, but were recently sold off completely to private developers. Others more directly follow Kensington and Carlton, like the project in Ascot Vale, where 80 public units were demolished in favour of 88 community and affordable houses and 112 purely private houses. Which again, there's been feasibility studies carried out on the Ascot Vale estate that finds that the government can actually add more beds and save more money by simply refurbishing and building on top and around of existing infrastructure, as opposed to demolishing and displacing. To reiterate, community and affordable housing affords less protections and rights to tenants compared to their public counterparts. Rent is often quite a bit higher compared to their public counterparts, and the social mix model is at best unproven and at worst demonstrably ineffective. And it's not as if horror stories aren't coming out of these supposedly most advanced social and affordable housing projects either. In that Ascot Vale estate, for example, the entire block of community housing had severe issues with running water and plumbing for 3 weeks straight after it opened, before any kind of maintenance even came in. A 2020 study published by the Housing for the Age Action Group found that community housing organisations lack fairness and transparency in their allocation processes and discriminate against prospective tenants on the basis of income, health requirements, accessibility needs, and assumptions about a person's character. Compared to public housing, which is much more reliant on government spending, community housing is more reliant on rental income than their government subsidies, meaning they're incentivized to let out to renters with higher incomes, particularly with the comparatively loose requirements of the social housing waiting list. According to the Victorian Ombudsman, tenants have less confidence in community housing providers than they do public housing, despite the clear decades-long neglect of said public housing. As noted by the Inner Melbourne Community Legal Centre, the ability to take absence of 6 months from their property at reduced rent if they cannot stay at their homes for such reasons of family violence, are receiving medical treatment including as a mental health inpatient or have gone to prison, the right to have their home modified for disability and safety reasons, their rent limited to 25% of their income, and the ability to transfer to another public housing property when their needs change, such as their family grows. The waitlist for transfers are long given the low supply. However, the ability to transfer from an inappropriate home is critical for the needs of individuals and families. These same rights aren't afforded to community housing tenants. For example, community housing providers can charge up to 30% of rent and 100% of rental assistance. And probably most importantly, the growth in community housing over the last decade has been ineffective, completely ineffective, at meeting the demand faced in the growing public housing waiting list. Keep in mind the people who need discounted housing. It's immunocompromised people, disabled people, single mothers, people out of all of us in society need those basics the most. The entire reason the government rebuilt a lot of these properties, supposedly, was because they were aging, they were falling apart, the infrastructure was inadequate, yet the people aren't doing better, or they aren't doing as good as they could be if the government were doing its due diligence. In fact, again, another 100 or so pages of research that actually finds that, yeah, the government can renovate instead of demolishing these public housing estates for a cheaper price. It can expand these estates to add new public units, which would match the amount of private units added in its current plans, and importantly, retain the public land and housing. As said by one of the most cited and comprehensive papers in this specific field, Lawson et al. 2018, the research shows that the capital grant model, i.e. direct public investment, supplemented by efficient financing, i.e. not underfunding, provides the most cost-effective pathway for Australia. So the pilot projects fell flat. The PHRP projects are in the process of falling flat. There are quite literally thousands of pages of reports and studies specifically devoted to how terrible and ineffective and wasteful the Victorian government's public housing policy is. It's not as if the current government has any doubt or it's stepping into unknown territory. You cannot find a single credible source outside of a government spokesperson themselves that backs up these half-assed, meager policies. And I'm sorry if that's too opinionated, but I feel like no one in traditional media is emphasizing how unfounded and contrary to the abundantly available evidence the government's policies are. To me, it's a bias in the government's favor to not point out how damning this is. So then, why are they applying the same failed formula to the public housing towers? It's all about who the government listens to. They don't listen to academics, they're broke. The PHRP was based on 2 reports by the real estate consultancy group of M21. The group was interested in the profitability and real estate attractiveness of the estates. Recently revealed documents show who's in the room when discussing the public housing towers. For example, a meeting about the investment into the government-owned housing towers features numerous top-ranking government officials and executives of investment and property companies. In its ever-growing reliance on the Big Four consultancy firms, similar recently surfaced documents reveal that EY, one of the Big Four, has run the costs and potential returns of selling off some of the towers. It's clear that the government is in constant communication with those interested and those with expertise in what makes the most profit. Not even what does the best for state finances, which again, renovations would be cheaper than demolition, as said here by Capital 2022 about the Northcote Walker Estate.
Social housing tenants will be clustered at the northeastern corner of the site and closer to the busy street, while the buildings with creek views are allocated to private housing. Given that waterside apartments are typically considered more desirable to tenants, it can be inferred that the layout of tenures is a result of real estate profitability rather than a desire to foster social integration.
Now you may say, there's no way that the Victorian Labor Party is in the pocket of property developers. If you read any newspaper or listen to the news, you'll undoubtedly read op-ed after op-ed from the AFR or the Age, from this investor and that developer about how stringent the Victorian government is, whether it be new taxes on vacant land or its numerous changes to tenancy laws. Surely the Victorian government has shown itself to be quite at odds with property developers. To show how these two things can be true at the same time, that the Victorian government is both in the pocket of property developers and investors, but also has done things contrary to their interests, we need to go on a little tangent. Just entertain the hypothetical for a second. Back in the 70s and 80s, despite the Liberals being overtly much more friendly and cooperative with the business sector and the CIA, in the end, both forces ended up backing the Labor Party and specifically Bob Hawke. This was because at the time, they favoured what they called a little here, little there de-radicalising approach. So while the people in charge weren't their staunchest allies, and they'd probably have to give up some stuff, ultimately it proved to be a power play, as Hawke was able to pacify the union movement and left wing of the party, whilst at the same time maintaining the powerful position held by the Americans and big business and their standing with the government. Likewise, the Victorian Labour Party has been in power for over a decade now, as the Liberals have been floundering around. And while in a perfect world property developers may not want a Labour government, they recognise that in Victoria, the tide has turned and they need to claw what they can. So while they can cop some in terms of vacant land taxes, which aren't exactly enforceable, on the macro scale, they've been able to secure their interest in key bits of legislation. You see this not only in their involvement in the big housing bill, but also the recently signed housing accord between the Victorian Government, the Property Council, Master Builders Association, the Urban Development Institute of Australia, the Housing Industry Association, and Super Housing Partnerships. The previous premier's inner circle featured rich lister property developer Max Beck of Beckton Corporation and a score of other prominent businessmen. Plus, even in regards to that land vacancy tax, it appears that the measure has failed to tax 90% of empty properties in Melbourne. It relies too much on voluntary reporting, and even some peak bodies like the Property Investors Council of Australia actually support the tax in its current form. The other thing to note is that the tax often targets properties that are just derelict or completely empty with zero electricity usage. A way that a lot of investors with empty properties keep their house off that list is they go down to their property and they turn on the lights or turn on the taps for a few hours once or twice a year. If you think that sounds ridiculous, it is, and I know people who've done that. So this whole time I've been attacking the Victorian government and the Labour Party, and hopefully you can see that I've done so with evidence. But what has the government and maybe its sympathisers said about this policy? Basically, they faint before hitting you with a straight right. It's no secret that public housing in the state is in disrepair. As I mentioned before, reports dating back to the early 90s have repeatedly informed the government of just how underfunded and critical the condition of public housing estates are. And so, after thousands of pages of investigation and inquiry, the Victorian government in 2017 decided they cared and they announced an inquiry which released its findings in 2018. The inquiry echoed the concerns raised in previous reports that public housing in the state was in dire straits and needed a clear, ambitious strategy. Nick Farr, a senior public servant, said at one of the hearings that we are replacing some of the worst stock in our portfolio. There is some other stuff that we need to replace as well. The towers fail against noise, sustainability, waste and recycling, bedroom area dimensions, room depth, ventilation, private open space, accessibility, and minimum amenity standards. Daniel Andrews personally has said that they're crumbling and out of date. So yes, clearly everyone is aware of just how poorly kept these towers are, even if it took the government a while. That's the feign. The government feigns to care for the crumbling state of public housing and then hits you with their solution: sell off large tracts of public housing in favour of community and private developments. To quote the West Heidelberg Legal Services submission to the inquiry, the problems arising from the decades-long underinvestment in public housing are well known. The diminishing role of public housing in the provision of stable and secure housing in Victoria is evident across the state. We are troubled by the trend which seeks short-term financial gains rather than long-term solutions. There is a concerning level of sale of public housing land to private hands without any requirement that it will be used for future public housing development. If we continue to sell off public land, as has been occurring, there is going to be less and less land for the public or social housing, and it'll be even harder to build public housing. We appear to be doing this even though we know the population is increasing and that the additional costs which will be associated in the longer term in buying back land from private hands. We argue that this approach is short-term and costly in the long run. It is known, and it has likely been submitted here a number of times, that the public housing renewal program will in fact reduce the number of public housing bedrooms available for occupation by about a third where we can see. This is a significant reduction in public housing capacity. It would not make sense to demolish a 1,000-bed hospital and replace it with 2 400-bed hospitals and describe it as doubling of the hospital capacity. So yes, public housing has been in decay. However, that fact doesn't necessarily justify the government's actions. As pointed to by the submission, it's a short-term, profitable fix to something very clearly endemic, something that spanned decades. Say what you want about Noam Chomsky, but what he is banging on about here really applies to this situation.
There's a standard way of privatizing something. Like when Margaret Thatcher wanted to privatize the British railroads, the technique was defund them. And then when they don't work, people get angry. They say, let's do something. So you hand it over to private enterprise, which totally ruins them, and then the state has to come back in, big cost, and try to reconstruct it somehow.
Essentially, they've waited for the public housing system to fall into such disrepair that any redevelopment or resolution they throw at it can look and sound appealing. But just because they're adding nominally more units to their redeveloping all these properties doesn't mean that it's the best course of action to take, and the literature and lived experience of the tenants has affirmed that argument. I don't get to resolve to keep punching you just because stabbing you is worse. To summarize the entirety of the problem, if you need a quick soundbite, link this part of the video. Public housing in Victoria has been underfunded and neglected for decades. We need a solution. The government in the last decade has only built 300 public homes, despite waiting lists rising above 60,000 households. Not only that, but it has begun to destroy currently existing public housing. After these demolitions, the government plans to sell off parts or entire sites to private developers and community housing organizations, essentially privatization. It's doing this supposedly for two different reasons. One, so it can mix lower income public housing tenants with higher income private tenants in order to reduce stigma. Two, so it can rely on private sector financing to hopefully build more homes. Social mix theory has not stood the test of academic rigor, particularly in the Melbourne setting. By virtue of being reliant on the private sector, maximizing profit is prioritized over social good. As a result, the social mix model ends up segregating public and private tenants to the detriment of public tenants, as the better facilities are reserved for those who can pay more. And while yes, the private sector financing does build more units, it often reduces the amount of bedrooms, and it's not as if the government can't build more units and bedrooms itself. Private tenants are much more able to seek rentals elsewhere compared to public tenants, and so while the government is increasing housing supply, it is completely marginal to what have already occurred in the housing market anyway, all the while hardly tackling the growing public housing waiting list and the amount of homeless people in this state. So then, instead of this policy, which has zero academic rigor behind it and has the blessing and involvement of property developers and investment firms, what can we, or the state government, do to fix the problems faced?
Whether you can afford to do it, it's whether you can afford not to.
There are two facets to this problem. What can the government do right now, and what is a more holistic, long-term, paradigm-shifting change? The current Victorian government can effectively house everyone in the state and renovate and expand its public housing stock as a way to alleviate rental and housing stress, all in 5 years. The first step is to establish a new statutory authority, or essentially a government company, and call it the Victorian Housing Trust. The second step is to seize all vacant and underutilized land. According to Prosper Australia, there are 100,000 homes in metropolitan Melbourne alone that use between 0 to 50 litres of water a day. For the record, the average person consumes 164 litres a day, meaning some landlords and investors try to get around it by going in once or twice a year by turning on the taps or leaving on the lights. Prosper's analysis also leaves out the suburbs which have the most beach/holiday homes. This means that there are effectively 100,000 empty residential properties in Melbourne at any given time. In all of Victoria, the current public housing waiting list is 60,000 households, and there are currently 30,000 homeless people. So if we were to repurpose all 100,000 homes, we can meet the needs of the most vulnerable people in this state in literally a few months. Key is ensuring that all of the properties remain in public hands, administered by that housing trust. This not only has precedence generally. The Victorian government recently forcibly seized over 100 occupied properties to build the North East Link project, but the Victorian government has actually seized empty properties to then repurpose them for new housing in the past. Back in the 1980s, the Kane Labor government seized unused factories and warehouses and repurposed them into thousands of new public homes. Given that adds up to 90,000 or so new households now in homes, we have 10,000 or so homes in excess, which means if people do need to temporarily relocate for renovations, there are affordable and secure options available, and they remain in the public housing system. Right now, the Victorian government can't promise the 10,000 people who live in the towers right now secure housing, which then leads to the second step, renovations. It is undeniable that for many, public homes are derelict, they're in a state of disrepair. To ensure that tenants aren't left in the dark or left alone to face government bureaucracy, there needs to be some kind of mechanism or way for people to easily voice their problems, and for the government to actually hear them. So the government should establish a tenants complaints office and have qualified inspectors or even a foreman ready to go if the tenants need it. Maybe even some kind of tenants assembly that has binding decision-making powers. Once again, the government has hundreds of pages right here in their own reports on how they can improve communication and involvement with tenants overnight. The third step then is that the government needs to be more careful with how it allocates money and resources. The Victorian government has numerous infrastructure projects that not only are costing us tens of billions of dollars, but are taking resources and workers who could otherwise be working on building sites for housing. Instead of another highway, which sure could have its benefits, we should be directing workers and materials towards building more necessary fundamental infrastructure, ensuring that everyone in the state has a roof over their head. Particularly while we're in a labour and material shortage, managing what we build and when we build it is important. Now, this isn't just me saying this, the Productivity Commission has voiced its concerns with state governments putting too much money, time, labour and resources into these mega projects. So instead of building the North East Link, it should have been put towards more critical infrastructure like public housing. The government can still renege, as while the North East Link is probably not reversible, the suburban rail loop is. In 3 easy steps there, we can house every single person in Victoria. We can renovate the public housing towers, we can continue to build more housing for the coming generations, and for those currently in rental and housing stress. All of that in 5 years. Daniel Andrews could have done it when he was elected in 2014 or in 2018, and it would have been done by now. So why wouldn't the Labor Party, the party of workers who want to achieve social justice, fairness, inclusion, and equality, commit to such a policy? Most of the things done in our lives are done for money. The profit motive drives our world. Those who own things, the companies who make things, whether they like or we like to admit it, make the world move. And so even if governments do some things that might not be what business particularly likes, they more or less have to abide by their rules. This is the truth and fundamental flaw with any government seeking reform. No matter how starry-eyed, progressive, ambitious a political party may be, they have to navigate and network with who has power and who has the money. If we want to solve this crisis in a real way that isn't just a band-aid, like even the policies that I just proposed are simple fixes that aren't long-term, then we have to find ways to create a housing market or a way to distribute housing to people without the main goal or outcome being money for someone at the top. Now, decommodifying housing is beyond the scope of this video, but I think it's something to think about, and it's something I've discussed before here if you're interested. This system isn't only failing homeless people, people on the waiting list, it's failed most of us, particularly the coming generations. A fundamental rethink of how we build and distribute housing is necessary if we're actually going to even think about scraping the surface of this housing crisis. Now, in terms of what you can do, unfortunately, there's not much outside of showing up at rallies and donating or even volunteering for the Inner Melbourne Community Legal Centre, the lawyers who filed the class action lawsuit against the government. If you're in the Labor Party, join Labour for Housing. They're an advocacy group trying to fight for change within the party, and they're doing good work. There's the Greens, Victorian Socialists, Socialist Alliance, etc. All these kind of groups and parties. They're doing really good work right now. If you're interested, I'd advocate for joining them, or at least volunteering or getting involved in the specific campaign. If you're in some kind of union, or specifically a construction union, think about bringing up these more social and political questions in the workplace or to your delegate. There are examples of unions in the past, even construction unions, moving beyond trying to get a good EBA for their members and using industrial action to better their community. The leader of the CFMEU, Zach Smith, has articulated an ambitious social housing plan before, and I think there's ways to really start to push and get some weight behind it. If your mum's Jacinta Allen, hi, maybe convince her not to do this? Cheers. Big shout out to the people who made these videos, as while my video is more academic and a bit more macro focused, these people went and interviewed the actual people involved, so please check them out. Thank you to everyone who's helped make this video, my girlfriend, Freem, Kenna, Purple Pingers, etc. I don't usually do this, but please consider donating to the Patreon. It took a lot of time and effort, and there was a few things to get around when making this. I read way too many dry government reports the size of books for my liking, so please, even if you just subscribe, like, whatever, any support, I highly appreciate. But regardless, thank you so much for watching.